Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome. It's really a pleasure to have all of you here in the house and those out in cyberspace to join us on this discussion. This is a topic that has been growing in my awareness for quite some time as I've worked with a number of people who have had very severe trauma and others with relatively minor trauma. But it was the severe ones that actually got me really excited about the topic and really interested in what could be done with people who had a variety of kinds of experiences, but the truth is that most of them were acts of physical violence. And it had been very, very traumatic for the people. And of course, what that means is that they had a very strong reaction to it, and that it was continuing to produce difficulties in their lives in the present time. And so it was on the basis of those experiences that I began to find that the techniques that I had and that I was continuing to learn were proving to be extremely valuable in working with people. And one of the things that immediately appealed to me was that people did not have to do the hard work, as people so often say, in one form or another. And I was just reading some more. I decided I'd go back and read some more traditional psychology about trauma, and just to make sure that I was up to date on what people were thinking. And everybody seemed to say that working with trauma well, not the working with people, but the people who had the trauma, it was very difficult work and it took a really long time. And everybody in the room I know knows that I'm a very impatient person, and I like to get things done in a short order, straight away, and get it taken care of. And of course, I was therefore very delighted to find that the approach that I used could be extremely successful in removing the charge of trauma, the energy that is implanted in people when they have a traumatic experience or series of traumatic experiences. And that it could be done, the energy could be cleared very, very easily and very quickly. And of course, it always helps if people have done some prior work. But typically what I find is that most people who have done a lot of prior work actually wind up, I guess the fair thing to say is they psychoanalyze everything. They think everything through. They scrutinize, they analyze everything. And that becomes a kind of mode of functioning. In other words, what they learn in therapy is to, scrutinize and analyze. And that means that they kind of keep everything up on that level of thinking. And they don't really get into a process that truly clears the energy, the impact of the trauma from their physiology. And of course, there's a lot written about, how trauma resides in the body, trauma resides in the nervous system, trauma resides in our memory, and various, both traditional theological approaches and even some of the new age ones. They talk about the various levels of physical manifestation. There's the astral level, and then that's the emotional level, and the thinking level, and then the physical level of the body. And it's very clear. We know that trauma can eventually cause people to have diseases, what looks like diseases. And they're often labeled with various kinds of disorders. There's a dissociative disorder and a PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and other labels get put on people. Psychologists are really good at labeling things. I happen to have been raised by a psychiatrist. Most of you know that. And one of the things I learned from my father was that he did not like to label people. He really didn't like to put diagnoses on people. And the reason was very simple. That label becomes an identity. Just as I was just describing, the therapeutic process itself becomes an identity. And so you're always working on yourself and you never quit. And I've always had this disease. And it's one of the reasons why I have some concerns about 12-step programs, because and I'm going to just use alcoholic for example, you start off by saying, I am an alcoholic. And you say that forever. And that is not necessarily untrue, but it is constantly reinforcing to yourself that you have a problem with alcohol, and therefore that you're not quite right in some way. And that kind of negative imaging of oneself is a big part of the traumatic experience. There's a lot of self-blame, self-criticism, lack of self-worth. What's the opposite of lack of self-worth? The lack of it, though. How do we don't have a word for that. Poor self-image. Yeah, it's just another way of putting a negative word in front of a positive one. Poor self-image, though, is fine. Yeah, most people who have had trauma generally have very poor self-image. The other thing that that I found in the reading is that the variety of symptoms that show up is enormous, and there was somebody I saw who had written who had said they had had 25 different diagnoses in their life, as if each of those labels somehow provided an answer. And that's another thing about labels, by the way, is that they're used. Labels are simply ways of saying, classifying behaviors that are apparent, that are present, and thought patterns. And but then they become a thing, and so it's a way of defining. It becomes a defining statement about somebody and about oneself. So, and it also therefore becomes an excuse. Well, I can't do that because I'm so and so, manic depressive or bipolar or schizoaffective or any one of the innumerable other things that appear in those manuals of diagnosis. So that's why my father really didn't like putting labels on people, because it put them in a cubbyhole, and it said, this is what you are, this is, and then maybe you'll get better if you stay in therapy long enough. And that wasn't a very positive thing. I'd like to think that my father helped a lot of people. A lot of people said they were very much helped by him. And I heard many, many stories. People came to me even after he had passed and said, oh, I wouldn't be alive today if it weren't for your father, or my wife wouldn't be alive, or someone else wouldn't be alive. So I do believe that psychotherapy can be very, very helpful to people. But it's a long process. And when it comes to trauma and seeing the myriad of symptoms that show up, if you put labels on the people, as someone pointed out, and I really enjoyed reading about it, it takes you away from the idea that, oh, what they're doing is manifesting responses to trauma. And I come back, you've heard me say this many times, to Marshall Rosenberg's wonderful, wonderful statement that the bizarre things that people do, he called them tragic expressions of unmet needs. And the idea was that they're coping mechanisms. They're things that we learn to do. One of the things that I learned very early on in my work with trauma was that people often, in situations of repeated trauma, repeated abuse is what it was, they disappear. They just go off into a place where, they're gone. They're not there present in the experience any longer. And the consequence of that is that as an adult, they often cannot be present in intimate situations. They just go away, and they regard that as a problem, and their therapists regard that as a problem, and they're labeled as being dissociative or some other thing. And it's not usually acknowledged that mechanism, though no longer actually needed, was a mechanism that proved to be extremely effective in dealing with a traumatic situation, a repeated traumatic situation. And when you say to someone, oh, what you're doing, that is something you did to protect yourself. But you learned that in the past. So now in the present, when you get that uncomfortable feeling, you feel threatened, that's what you do. You use that particular behavior pattern. And there are various patterns that people use, but that dissociation is one of the most common. And it's very hard for therapists to get people to work through that. And part of the reason for that is they're not understanding that that is an appropriate defense response. And when you reframe that experience as something that you did that was effective in avoiding the pain of the trauma, it completely changes the situation. And I've actually seen that happen literally instantly. It's like somebody's bemoaning the fact that they, that every time they try to be intimate with somebody, they're just gone and they can't control it. And as soon as they understand that that's protective, and then think about the next step, there's another step, and the next step is now I'm in the present and I don't need that. I don't need to protect myself. I feel like I need to protect myself, but I don't actually need to protect myself. And then they start to make that. And of course, in the background, I do the energy work to change the energy so that they become free to actually have the experience of being with someone, being intimate with someone. And it's amazing how simple that actually is. And it doesn't take very long. Often it's just 1 or 2 sessions working with someone to achieve that level of freedom. Freedom's a good word for that. That level of freedom to be able to experience intimacy in a much deeper way than they've ever been able to experience it before. And then it just takes a little practice to be able to do that. And hopefully, that the person that they're with in the intimate experience understands that, so that they can let the person know, like, we got to pause here for a moment while I, remind myself to be here in the present right now. And I'm not back then when I was being abused. And just they take that pause and then they come back into the present and then they can deal with that. Now, when we talk about abuse, and as I said, as a clinician, I think I've always enjoyed the really dramatic cases, but everybody has had some kind of trauma in their lives. It may be big stuff, it may be, relatively minor stuff. And most of us have had any number of instances or ongoing situations. It might have been just a situation at work, or a situation at home, or with siblings, or with college roommates, or whatever it might be. You may have gotten into a fight with somebody at some time in your life, in a situation that was just out of control. Or you may have had an ongoing situation. When I started writing about these things and then thinking about what I was going to be discussing with you tonight, I was thinking about some of what I would call traumas in my life. And they weren't the great big ones. They were the little ones. But I remember a college roommate that was an interesting experience. And it took a while for me to work through that and get used to a character with whom I felt I had absolutely nothing in common and who I found rather annoying by his habits. He was... I didn't know it at the time. I found out kind of at the end of our time together that he was using stimulants, and he would stay up for a day and a half and then sleep for about 14 hours. And I was trying to be on a relatively normal sort of schedule for a college student, and get to bed by 11 or 12 and get to class the next morning. And so having somebody in the room who was up all night, or asleep when I was trying to, go about my daily routine, was pretty trying. And, it took me a while to work it out. And eventually, I think we arranged for him to have a private room. I think that's what we did with the dean of housing or the dean of students or something. There was some way we worked it out. But, that was just one of the many experiences that I've had that I would say was really quite difficult, quite challenging for me, quite traumatic in a way. And that really required me to find a new set of resources for dealing with a situation like that. And ultimately, when we're working with trauma, I think that's one of the things that we do is we find alternative ways of dealing with situations that, I would just use the common term, trigger us, that set us off in some way, that make us feel really uncomfortable. And so we need to develop those skills. So when I work with people with trauma, I can usually tell right off the bat how many sessions it will take, typically 2 or 3 sessions to actually deal with the energy of the trauma, which is an extraordinary statement if you know anything about the field. But it takes some more sessions, typically anywhere from 3 to 6 more sessions, to reprogram the responses and to train a person to be able to realize they're being triggered, because it's a habit and it's an automatic response at this point, to realize they're being triggered, to stop, remind themselves that they're in the present, they're actually safe, they're not really threatened like they had been before, and to remember the skills that they're developing, and to actually learn some skills that they're developing to be able to deal with specific kinds of situations. Worked with someone recently where the work environment was quite stressful and was a powerful trigger to childhood experiences where the boss and coworkers were similar in the feeling level. They didn't look alike, but that they were triggers because there was this history, and so the person was responding in their work environment, and of course they were called a very difficult employee because they kept flying off and getting angry and upset, and I'm not sure all the things that happened, but I have a feeling that others would have called it dramatic. And so dramatic, not traumatic. And so it was a difficult situation, and we were able to bring up some examples and work through them. We just kind of did little practice sessions to learn how to actually make responses. And of course, because of the history of trauma, there's a history of interpretation. And in this particular case, it was an interpretation of intention. And so they tended to feel that people focused on them, this particular client. And this is not necessary, this is by no means a universal phenomenon, but they tended to feel that they were being singled out or focused on in a particular kind of way that was making them very uncomfortable. And so one of the things they had to learn to do was to actually not jump into the judgment about it, but to actually look at the situation and ask themselves very seriously, and meaning innocently, is that really being directed at me, or am I just, because I'm so habituated to the experience, am I just responding to it as though it was being directed at me? And if it is directed at me, so what? And that's a really dramatic, simple thing to skill to learn. If somebody you feel is picking on you, and it may just be that they criticize everybody or everybody's work, that they're just very negative sort of person. If you feel that way, and you can ask yourself that question, so what? The answer eventually becomes, I don't like it, but I don't have to react to it with a fight or flight stress response. I don't have to fly off. I don't have to get angry. I don't have to get anything, right? I can just walk away from it or just ignore them. I kind of stand there, just take it and then, sure, boss. And, but no, they can really learn how not to react to a situation from a pre-programmed pattern. And we call those patterns as ways of thinking. We call them memes. You've heard that word many times from me, MEME. And a meme is we always liken it to a subroutine in a computer program. It helps to get things done in a computer program. These memes that get implanted in our brains can help us navigate the world, but sometimes they're quite deleterious and don't give us flexibility in looking at a situation afresh. It's almost as if we were becoming senile, rigid in our thinking. We see something and we make a response, and we don't have any other way of responding. We can't control the response, and we can't step back and look at a thing and maybe make a different response, just decide to make a different response. So the memes can be helpful, or they can be inhibiting, blocking to us. And for most people, most of the memes that you have are blocking, and they keep us, from being able to deal with situations. And so we have to sometimes find those memes. We have to recognize that, oh, there's this subroutine running in my operating system that says that when my boss says something about my work, that's about him and his expectations, and not necessarily about me personally, though he makes it sound that way. Because, wow, I've had this history of people blaming me for things that were not actually in my control. This is a big part of trauma, by the way. It's called locus of control. And one of the things that trauma victims tend to do is to blame themselves for what happened. They tend to take responsibility for what happened, and feel that it's inevitable because that's just who I am and I caused these things to happen to me. And oftentimes adults have told them that. So it's not just that they make it up. It's often something that adults will, we say a trip that adults lay on kids, and bosses lay on employees, and spouses lay on each other. It's a very, very common thing. And then what happens is you tend to then blame yourself for these things that are happening. And particularly in a situation of a child may do something that breaks a parent's rules, but the parent's reaction, the abusive reaction, the physical abuse, the demeaning behavior, often violent behavior, right, is the parent's responsibility. It's not the child's responsibility. Parents will say it's your fault. You are a bad person and you need to be punished. And the punishment will be very severe and painful and hurtful. And then the child eventually goes, yes, I'm a bad person and I need to change. And the history of this goes deeply into our cultural tradition. It's thousands of years old. And the idea that some of you may have heard, children should be seen and not heard, and children are born in sin, and the sin, basically what they say is the sin has to be beaten out of them. Yeah, I can see that that drew some familiar responses there. And it's very, very common in our culture, and it's deeply established. It goes back thousands of years. And it's a very interesting point of view, but it's not necessarily true. We just tend to believe it's true. I was just watching with Lisa last night a program on it's called The Suffragettes. It was a movie that came out a couple of years ago, I believe. And it was about women in England who campaigned for the right to vote. And it was basically an historical movie. It was not a documentary per se, but a kind of a novel based on reality. And it showed people coming to question the norms of society. And of course, the creators and enforcers of those norms were the men. And the women were feeling, just as slaves did in this country, and women in this country too, of course, they didn't have the right to vote either, that they were human beings and they had inalienable rights, and that the men were basically enslaving them, and that wasn't right. And that's a huge, huge shift in mindset. And that same mindset is what happens to people who are victims. And of course, in in society, all too often, even today, women are victims, treated badly by men, put down, paid less for similar work, and so on and so forth. Um, the scene in this particular movie was it was a laundry that she worked in. The gal who was the lead in the story, a figure person, and the boss in the laundry was just horrible to the women. Just treated them terribly. Was very, very abusive. Ordered them around, criticized, berated them, and occasionally took one of them into the back office. So his behavior was totally predatory and controlling. And in some sense, he actually caused this particular woman to become a suffragette. It also happened partly by accident, the way they told the story. But she began to reflect on what her life was like and to question whether it necessarily had to be that way. And so a victim of trauma, person with sustained trauma, often finds themselves in that situation where they haven't yet questioned whether or not it has to be like this. And when they finally ask that question sincerely, really, does it really have to be like this? Who said it had to be like this? They said it had to be like that, but they're the ones who are abusing me. So maybe it doesn't have to be that way. Maybe it can be different. And then comes, how do we go about changing the situation? What do we have to do? And the suffragettes in the story in England actually got rather violent and started breaking windows, randomly attacking business establishments that were, notorious for their abusive conduct. They eventually blew up the not yet finished new house of the prime minister. I think it was the prime minister. And they actually made dynamite. They didn't buy it. They had to create it out of, I guess it was charcoal and saltpeter and who knows what else they put in it. And they went out in the middle of the night and planted dynamite in the house and lit a fuse and ran and barely got far enough away that they didn't get killed. Um, but that's what it took. And of course, we've seen similar things in this country. Certainly, the suffragette movement, later the civil rights movement, the Poor People's Campaign, been a whole variety of we'll call them movements. That's a good word, actually. I think of attempts to change society, to change the values of society, to produce more freedom for oppressed groups. So with all of that introduction, I think we should get down now to our group healing session.